If you want to know when a society starts to punish its middle class, do not begin with the stock market. Begin at the gas pump. Begin at the grocery aisle. Begin with the quiet look on a family's face when the same paycheck buys less this month than it bought last month, and no one in that family can explain why they are working just as hard but falling behind faster. I have watched markets for most of my life, and I can tell you something people learn too late. Oil is never just oil. It is transportation. It is fertilizer. It is shipping. It is packaging. It is airfare. It is heating. It is the hidden pulse inside the cost of almost everything you touch. That is why the last time oil behaved like this, it did not merely create a headline, it wounded the middle class. And when I hear people say today that this is just another temporary commodity spike, I know many of them still do not understand the machinery they are standing inside. The danger is not the first jump in price. The danger is what that jump touches next. When energy gets expensive, the pressure does not stay in one place. It moves, it flows, it works its way through the economy like water, finding every crack in a foundation. At first, people notice gasoline, then freight becomes more expensive. Food follows, travel follows, insurance follows. Small business margins get thinner. Household budgets get tighter. Employers get colder. Confidence breaks before the official numbers do. Spending slows before the economists give it a name. By the time the recession is officially recognized, the middle class has usually been living inside it for months. That is the part I want you to see. I do not care whether television decides to call it a slowdown, a soft patch, a correction, or a technical contraction. I care about whether ordinary people can still breathe after paying for the necessities of life. I care about whether businesses can still hire without flinching. I care about whether families still feel secure enough to make long commitments. That is what tells you the truth. The great error of modern finance is that too many people believe recessions begin in spreadsheets. They do not. They begin in decisions. A family decides not to replace the car. A young couple decides not to buy the house. A small business decides not to hire the extra worker. A company decides to delay expansion. A manager decides to cut staff because margins are slipping and borrowing costs are still high. None of those decisions looks dramatic on its own. Together, they become the economy. And when oil shocks arrive at the same moment that the labor market is already being reorganized by artificial intelligence, you no longer have a normal cyclical scare. You have an overlapping pressure event. That is the phrase I would use if I wanted to name the mechanism. An overlapping pressure event is what happens when one force attacks demand, while another force attacks labor security, and a third force attacks confidence. Oil hits affordability, AI hits job stability, fear hits spending. Put those three together and you do not need a catastrophe to create real damage. You just need enough time. History teaches this in a tone most people refuse to hear until after the pain arrives. Every oil shock is not identical, but most of the serious ones carry the same logic. Energy spikes behave like a tax. Not a tax voted on in Congress, not a tax mailed to you on official paper, a tax hidden in the price of survival. It reaches everyone, but it punishes those with the least flexibility most severely. A wealthy household notices the extra cost and adjusts. A middle-class household notices the extra cost and sacrifices. A poor household notices the extra cost and breaks. That is the progression. And the most dangerous part is that it often arrives after a period when people were already stretched. They already financed the bigger mortgage. They already took the car payment. They already accepted the higher grocery bill. They already relied on a little optimism about the future to justify the commitments of the present. Then oil rises. Then everything that was barely manageable becomes mathematically unforgiving. I have seen investors underestimate this because they spend too much time looking at averages, average wages, average savings, average debt burdens, average balance sheets. The middle class does not live in averages. It lives in monthly cash flow. It lives in timing. It lives in whether the bill is due before the paycheck clears. That is why a sudden increase in energy costs can do so much damage without looking apocalyptic on paper. The household budget does not need to collapse in theory. It only needs to fail in practice. This is where many people make a second mistake. They assume that if oil prices calm down later, the danger disappears. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes a short shock remains a shock. But when the price spike persists long enough to change behavior, it leaves a mark that remains after the commodity retreats. It teaches households to become defensive. It teaches businesses to become cautious. It teaches lenders to become selective. It teaches consumers to postpone. And an economy built on postponed decisions begins to lose momentum from the inside out. You can think of it as a chain. First link, energy becomes more expensive. Second link, the cost of goods rises. Third link, real purchasing power falls. Fourth link, consumers buy. Fifth link, revenues weaken. Sixth link, hiring slows or reverses. Seventh link, confidence falls further. That is not theory to me. That is the anatomy of a squeeze. Now, add the second machine now being installed across the economy. Artificial intelligence. I am not one of those men who believes every new technology destroys the world. I have spent my life benefiting from productive progress. Better tools increase output. Better systems remove waste. Better intelligence, whether human or machine, tends to reward those who adapt early and punish those who sleep through the transition. But adaptation is not painless. And this is where people are being far too careful. AI is not merely another software upgrade. It is a labor market filter. It changes what kind of worker is valuable, what kind of work is cheap, what kind of company can scale, and what kind of wage pressure survives. It does not need to eliminate all jobs to matter. It only needs to eliminate enough certainty. Once workers begin to suspect that their role can be compressed, automated, outsourced, or reorganized, they behave differently. They become more defensive with money. They delay big purchases. They accumulate cash. They reduce risk. In other words, they do exactly what a slowing economy does not want them to do. This is why I say the present danger is not just oil. It is oil colliding with an already fragile sense of labor security. If people were entering this period with cheap energy, strong confidence, and a stable sense that their work was unquestionably needed, the economy could absorb more strain. But that is not the world we are in. We are in a world where many companies are already rethinking headcount, where entry-level roles are being questioned, where white-collar certainty is no longer secure, and where the average family is still carrying the emotional residue of inflation. That residue matters. When people have already lived through a period in which prices rose faster than comfort, they do not respond to new pressure with innocence. They respond with fear memory. They remember what it felt like to watch essentials get more expensive while wages lagged. They remember what it felt like to wonder whether relief was actually coming. And when that memory is reactivated, they become more conservative faster. That is how confidence breaks, not in speeches. In memory, I have often said that markets move between greed and fear, but ordinary households move between hope and caution. The middle class does not need to believe in disaster to change behavior. It only needs to become less hopeful. Once that happens, the machine starts slowing itself down. A purchase delayed here, a renovation canceled there, a hiring plan paused elsewhere, a vacation abandoned, a second car not replaced, a subscription canceled, a restaurant skipped. These small acts of retreat are invisible in isolation. In aggregate, they shape revenues, inventories, payrolls, and eventually earnings. That is why I have never liked lazy commentary that tells investors to just focus on the index and ignore the structure underneath it. The index is not the structure. The index is the scoreboard. I want to know what game is being played, and the game right now is not complicated. The cost of living is vulnerable. The job market is being rewired. Consumer confidence is already fragile. That combination can become recessionary even before official definitions catch up. Now, I want to make something very clear because I do not enjoy drama disguised as analysis. A recession is not guaranteed every time oil rises. Markets can absorb surprising shocks, Conflicts can cool. Supply conditions can normalize. Governments and central banks can react in ways that soften the blow. Companies can remain profitable longer than expected. Consumers can prove more resilient than pessimists imagine. All of that is true. But prudence does not ask whether catastrophe is guaranteed. Prudence asks whether the structure has become more fragile than most people admit. On that question, my answer is yes. The middle class is more exposed today because it is trying to survive in a world that became more fixed. Cost-heavy, housing costs are higher, financing costs are higher, insurance costs are higher, basic services cost more. Many families are not balancing life on one major obligation. They are balancing life on several. That means when oil introduces another pressure wave, there is less room to absorb it gracefully. This is where identity flips. For years, the middle class was told that security came from consumption funded by optimism: buy the house, upgrade the car, stretch for the better district. Assume income will rise. Assume refinancing will stay available. Assume markets will bail out bad timing. Assume the future will be kind enough to justify present leverage. That identity is now being tested. The next winners are not going to be the households that look richest from the driveway. They are going to be the households that remain liquid, adaptable, and emotionally stable when the environment turns hostile. In other words, the identity must flip from consumer to allocator, from borrower to owner, from appearance to resilience, from reacting to positioning. That sounds philosophical, until you realize it is just arithmetic wearing a suit. If oil stays high, the middle class cannot consume its way to safety. It must restructure its way to safety. That is the beginning of the protocol. Before I talk about money, I want to talk about the emotional trap that destroys more families than bad spreadsheets. It is the temptation to wait for someone in authority to tell you the danger is real. That is one of the most expensive habits in modern life. By the time the problem is obvious enough for consensus, prices have already moved, jobs have already been lost, and opportunities have already changed hands. You do not build resilience by waiting for official permission. You build it by noticing pressure early. When I buy a good business, I do not wait for the crowd to feel comfortable. I want to understand the machine before the crowd does. The same principle applies to personal finance in a shifting economy. The individual who studies the mechanism early gets options. The individual who waits for comfort gets fewer of them. So what is the mechanism here? Let me name it plainly. The oil squeeze, the job squeeze, the confidence squeeze, those are the three blades. The oil squeeze makes living more expensive. The job squeeze makes income less certain. The confidence squeeze makes spending weaker and recovery slower. When all three are active, the middle class becomes vulnerable, not because it is foolish, but because it is trapped between obligations made in one regime and prices imposed by another. That is the real reason oil shocks can wipe out so much more than a few quarters of GDP growth. They reveal which balance sheets were built on fragile assumptions. They reveal which households were prosperous and which were simply leveraged. They reveal which companies can pass through costs and which ones get crushed between fixed expenses and weakening demand. In a period like this, I become less impressed by growth stories and more interested in durability. I want to know who can survive high costs, weaker sentiment, and tighter capital without needing rescue. That question applies to businesses and households alike. If you are an investor, you should care about this because volatility scares people for the wrong reasons. They fear the red numbers on the screen. I fear the misunderstanding underneath them. A market decline by itself is not the problem. A market decline layered on top of bad household positioning becomes the problem. Because that is when people sell what they should have held, borrow when they should have cut, and panic when they should have calmly allocated. This is where many fortunes are quietly redirected. Not because genius appears out of nowhere, because discipline does. The disciplined person does not deny the stress. He prepares for it. He studies what gets hurt first. He separates liquidity from leverage. He distinguishes a temporary markdown from permanent impairment. He understands that recessions and near recessions often create the best long-run buying windows precisely because most people are too emotionally injured to act rationally. That is not cruelty. That is simply how markets clear. The crowd wants certainty before buying. The intelligent allocator wants value before certainty. Now let me tell you what I would focus on if I were navigating an oil-driven fear cycle layered on top of AI-driven labor change. First, I would strengthen my household operating system before I tried to outsmart the market. Most people leap straight to what stock to buy. I would begin one layer deeper. I would ask whether my cash flow is sturdy enough to survive 6 to 12 months of uglier conditions without forcing bad decisions. If not, my first investment is not glamour. It is buffer. The person with liquidity can think. The person without it negotiates with reality from a position of weakness. Second, I would reduce dependence on fragile spending assumptions. That means I would stop treating every favorable month as permanent. I would not let temporary income confidence justify permanent obligations. This is where middle-class families get cornered. They confuse the ability to make the payment today with the ability to carry the obligation through a harsher environment tomorrow. Those are not the same thing. Third, I would keep buying productive assets, but I would buy them with a colder mind. That means broad productive assets first. Pieces of the economy that survive beyond the panic. Strong businesses, essential businesses, cash-generating businesses, businesses with pricing power, businesses that do not need a fantasy future to justify their present valuation. If markets mark them down because people are scared, I become more interested, not less. Fourth, I would separate hedges from engines. This is where people get confused in inflationary and geopolitical periods. They buy protection and expect it to behave like compounding. Gold can protect purchasing power. Energy exposure can benefit from a prolonged squeeze. Defensive sectors can help, but none of those should confuse you about the true engine of wealth, long-run wealth still comes from ownership of productive assets that generate rising value over time. Protection matters, but protection is not the whole machine. Fifth, I would invest in my ability to remain useful in an AI, reorganized labor market. That is not motivational fluff. That is portfolio management applied to your own earning power. If AI is compressing basic tasks, then the valuable worker is the one who can reason, judge, synthesize, communicate, persuade, design, allocate, decide, and improve systems. The more generic your work, the more vulnerable your income stream becomes. The more irreplaceable your judgment, the more resilient your income stream becomes. Your human capital remains one of the largest assets on your balance sheet, and most people neglect it until it is under attack. That is a major mistake. I have always admired people who adapt before desperation forces them to. In a changing economy, the highest return investment may not be the hottest ticker symbol. It may be the skill stack that protects and expands your earning power, while others are being commoditized. Now let me go deeper into what this environment does to markets, because this is where fear and opportunity begin to live in the same house. When oil remains elevated, one part of the market begins to price in slower demand, tighter margins, and more economic pain. Another part begins to price in persistent inflation, tighter monetary policy, and lower valuation multiples. Meanwhile, yet another part of the market begins to look for beneficiaries. Energy producers, select commodity-linked businesses, defensive cash generators, essential goods, parts of the economy with either hard pricing power or structural tailwinds. That does not mean you blindly rush into whatever has gone up recently. It means you understand that crises rarely punish and reward all sectors equally. Some businesses are victims of the squeeze. Others become toll collectors inside it. I would also watch one important thing that commentators often miss: duration. A short oil shock is pain. A long oil shock is adaptation. The first hurts household budgets. The second changes business behavior, hiring plans, capital spending, and political expectations. That distinction matters. If the shock is brief, many of the downstream effects remain limited. If the shock becomes persistent, then the economy starts reorganizing around it. That is when the risk to the middle class becomes more profound, because wages do not reprice upward as quickly as necessities do. Another thing I would not do is confuse market strength with household strength. Markets can rise while families weaken. Indexes can rally while affordability deteriorates. Asset owners can feel fine while wage earners absorb the damage. One reason so many people feel misled in modern economies is that they were taught to treat the stock market as a universal measure of well-being. It is not. It is a measure of capitalized expectations, not of everyday comfort. The middle class feels reality through bills, not through index levels. So when I talk about resilience, I am not talking about becoming emotionally numb. I am talking about refusing to let a hostile environment dictate irrational choices. That requires a system. My system would look something like this. Keep a meaningful liquidity reserve. Avoid stretching for image-driven liabilities. Own productive assets on a regular schedule. Use downturns to add, not to panic. Maintain some protection against inflation and geopolitical disorder. Relentlessly improve the quality of your earning power. Do not confuse a house with a retirement plan. Do not confuse salary with wealth. Do not confuse temporary calm with permanent safety. That is the blueprint. It is not flashy because real survival systems rarely are. Now I want to say something uncomfortable. The middle class is often wiped out long before it realizes what happened because it mistakes delayed consequences for safety. For a while, the bills still get paid. For a while, the credit cards still work. For a while, the employer still has not cut your roll. For a while, the market still has not fully repriced risk. For a while, life still resembles normal. And then one day you realize normal was living on yesterday's assumptions. That is why I tell people that economic turning points do not announce themselves with enough courtesy to save the unprepared. They emerge through lag. Prices move first, behavior changes second. Data confirms last. If you wait for the last stage, you are operating from behind. None of this means I am pessimistic about America. Quite the opposite. I remain deeply optimistic about the productive power of this country over long stretches of time. But optimism about a civilization is not the same thing as laziness about a cycle. America will likely remain productive. That does not mean households and portfolios cannot be badly hurt by transitions, shocks, and repricings along the way. I believe in owning a piece of the future. I also believe in surviving the present. The investors who do best over time are not merely the most optimistic. They are the ones who structure themselves so they can stay rational while others are structurally forced into bad behavior. That is the hidden edge. Rationality under pressure is a luxury purchased in advance. You buy it with liquidity, you buy it with modesty, you buy it with discipline, you buy it by refusing to let lifestyle inflation erase your margin of safety during the good years. People like to imagine that wealth is built in the exciting moments. Sometimes it is. But more often, wealth is preserved and then compounded by people who design their life to survive ugly moments without surrendering good assets at bad prices. So if oil is telling us something now, what is it telling us? It is telling us that fragility still exists. It is telling us that inflation can return through channels people thought they had moved past. It is telling us that the labor market is not entering this period from a position of old-fashioned certainty. It is telling us that the middle class remains one shock away from discovering how little room it really had. And it is telling disciplined investors that if panic becomes widespread, future bargains may appear in the exact places fear is now trying to blind them. That does not mean be reckless. It does not mean cheer for pain. It means be ready. There is a world of difference if you are carrying heavy debt. Simplify before the economy forces you to simplify. If you are living with no cash reserve, build one before stress prices it for you. If you have been treating every market dip like a prophecy of doom, retrain yourself to see quality on sale rather than just numbers falling. If your skills belong to an older labor regime, begin building new ones now while you still have emotional room to learn. If your family has been drifting financially without a real operating plan, make one. Because when the next stage begins, the people who will look calm are not the people who guessed perfectly. They are the people who respected the structure early. That is how you avoid becoming one more middle-class casualty in a period that punishes delay. I want to leave you with the real test, because all serious financial thinking eventually comes down to tests. If oil stayed high longer than you expect, if hiring weakened faster than you hoped, if the market gave you a sharper markdown than you wanted, and if confidence around you broke before the headlines admitted it, would your current life structure turn that environment into an inconvenience or into an emergency? That is the test. Not what you believe, not what you post, not what you hope central banks or politicians will do, what your structure would allow. If the answer is emergency, your work is obvious. If the answer is inconvenience, you have already done more right than most people know. And if the answer is opportunity, then you understand something most people only learn after the middle class has already been hit again. The great wealth transfers of history do not always begin with genius. Sometimes they begin with one group being forced to sell certainty, while another group had the patience, liquidity, and judgment to buy the future from them. That is why I do not watch oil as a commodity. I watch it as a verdict on how much hidden strain is already inside the system, a verdict on which households were truly resilient and which were merely celebrated during easier conditions, a verdict on whether you built your life to endure the world as it is, not as you wish it would be. In the end, the middle class does not get wiped out in one dramatic scene. It gets worn down in installments, a higher bill here, a postponed plan there, a weaker job market next, a little more fear after that. Then one day the family that thought it was stable realizes it has been spending from a future that never arrived. Do not let that be your story. Own the productive assets, learn the new tools, keep your obligations sane, buy when fear gives you value, and make sure the next time oil sends the same old warning through the economy, it finds you positioned as an owner with patience, not as a consumer with no margin left. That is how you survive the cycle. That is how you protect the years of your life. And that is how you turn a period that ruins many people into the decade that quietly changes yours.